All right, so I'm rolling. 3, 2, 1. Sound levels. Test, 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 test. Let me just introduce yourself, Bill, with your name.
My name is Bill Rowan. Need anything else?
And what's today's date? And
Today is what, the 18th? Is that right? November 18th, 2017. And Sam Shepard died roughly 4 or 5 months ago. He died in July of 2017. And I've got these two poems. If you don't mind, Jeff, I'm going to tell this. This poem tells about my first meeting with Sam Shepard, but there's some background to it that's kind of interesting. And I may have told you the story. I don't know. Okay, so this took place in 1966, and I had just graduated from UC Berkeley. I was 20 years old, so I was a little younger than most people when they graduate. And I had enrolled as a grad student in drama at UC Davis, so I was going to be there in the fall. And I really didn't know very much about the theater. I had spent basically 1 year at Berkeley doing some acting, and I was pretty involved, but that was about it. So I didn't know very much about the theater. And I had some friends in Boston who I knew from Cal. It was a couple. And they wanted me to come visit them. And the wife, Jean, sent me an ad she had clipped from the newspaper about a summer stock theater company that was starting up in Boston. And as you may know, and of course we don't really have summer stock theaters out here on the West Coast. They're almost unknown. And usually they're very plentiful on the East Coast, but they're generally in small towns or they're out in the country. But this one was going to be in Boston. And I wrote them, and they said I could be an apprentice at the summer stock theater, but I wouldn't get paid. They wouldn't charge me because sometimes the theaters will actually charge you to work in them. So I went out to Boston and I stayed with my friends, and then I got a place to stay, and I worked at this summer stock theater. And to make a long story short, the theater went broke in the middle of the season. But they had time left on their lease on the theater, so they still had the theater. And the director of the theater, who was a woman named Julie Portman, said, well, let's do a play just as a kind of an exercise, and I'll direct some of the apprentices. And she gave us a script by Sam Shepard. And this is one of his very best short plays. It's called Icarus's Mother. And we produced it for 2 performances. And it went over quite well. It had been done earlier in Boston by a different company. And she didn't have Shepard's permission to produce the play again. He didn't know, he wasn't even informed that we were doing the play. But it went over quite well, and it's a very extraordinary script. And after it was all over and they were winding down the theater, I said to Julie Portman, I said, well, gee, I'd really like to meet Sam Shepard. And she said, oh, no problem. All you got to do is go to New York. And he always hangs out at this place called the Cafe Chino in Greenwich Village. And just walk in there, he'll be there. And I said to her, oh, come on, you've got to be kidding. I could go all the way to New York, and he might be out of town or whatever. She said, just trust me. If you go to New York, you go to the Cafe Chino, you'll meet Sam Shepard. And I thought about it, and I thought, all right, okay, I'll give it a fling. And I hitchhiked to New York from Boston. And fortunately, I had an aunt in Long Island that I could stay with. But when I told her, okay, I'll be in New York, I didn't tell her I was hitchhiking. And so I went down to New York. I went to my aunt's house. They were very nice to me. They let me use one of their cars so I could drive into the Long Island Railroad station. So the next night, I walked into the Cafe Chino, and this is okay. So this is where the poem starts, and I'm looking for Sam Shepard. Okay, and the poem is called "At the Cafe Chino, New York City, 1966." He was sitting at a table by himself, reading a book and drinking a cup of coffee. I walked in and asked Joe Chino where I could find him. "Over there," Chino said, pointing him out. I approached his table. He asked me to sit down. We began talking and kept at it for well over an hour. He was about to have a book published, he said, his first. When the show began, it was a tiny place in the West Village, but they performed plays there. He decided to leave after giving me his phone number. I was 20 years old. He was 22. I stayed for the play. How was I to know he'd become famous? And even more amazing, that he deserved it.
Lovely.
So that's my poem. And sort of a little postscript. I also met two other playwrights who later became quite famous the same night, because that's the way the Cafe Chino was. It was a hangout for playwrights. One of them was Lanford Wilson. And much later, they received, Lanford Wilson and Sam Shepard received Pulitzer Prizes back to back. Shepard in 1979 for Buried Child, and Wilson in 1980 for Tally's Folly. And I also met on the same night Tom Ian, who later, and Tom was an incredibly talented, he later died of AIDS, but he was the author of the words and the book for a very big musical called Dreamgirls, which you may have heard of. So I met these three playwrights on the same night. Wilson invited me to have breakfast with him the next day, which I did. And so that's how I got to know Lanford Wilson. And Ian, I visited Ian's apartment also. And none of these people were known on the West Coast. None of them had ever had a play done on the West Coast. I was from the West Coast, and it was like I was God. It was like, oh my God, you can get a play of mine done on the West Coast? For a short while, I was very popular. And there's a lot more. I came back a year later, and I stayed in New York for 6 months. And of course, I saw a fair amount of Shepard, and I worked with Wilson on one of his plays. When I was at Davis, I directed the first West Coast production of plays by Shepard and Wilson, which were workshops, so they were both done for like one performance. And it turned out Shepard has two sisters. One of them was studying at Davis while I was there, and she didn't see the play. I did a short play of his called Chicago. But she knew people in the drama department, and somebody said, well, this crazy guy Rowan, he's directing one of your brother's plays. And she couldn't believe it, my God, somebody's doing one of my brother's plays in Davis. So they introduced me to her, and I met her also, and we had it. And I remember telling her.
Did she call you, "Hey, crazy guy Rowan"?
No, I'm just kidding. Well, I did have a reputation for being crazy, but she showed me, she had this scrapbook of clippings about and souvenirs about her brother, and it was a very thick scrapbook. Every time he did a play, he'd send her clippings and programs and photographs, and she was so proud of him. I just don't know how to describe it. And of course, he hadn't really gone anywhere at that point, but he was fairly well known on off Broadway. So I think at one point she said, well, what do you think about my brother? And I remember saying to her, well, I think he's like the Bob Dylan of the theater. I remember saying that to her. And she sort of looked at me like, wow, is that possible? But that's the way I thought about Sam Shepard at that time. And of course he did become, I think you could call him the Bob Dylan of the theater, legitimately. So many, many years passed. And I'm not going to go into all of my dealings with Sam Shepard, but at last we got the very sad news that he died earlier this year at the age of 73. And it's a little bit of a coincidence. Maybe it's not even worth mentioning. Lanford Wilson, who was several years older than Shepard, also died at the age of 73, which I think was in 2011. And that was a big event in New York. I'm not sure what they did with Shepard, but there was a memorial for Lanford Wilson. They got a hold of a Broadway theater, and I think they filled the theater for his memorial. I haven't heard of any memorials for Sam Shepard.
Well, we kind of had one today, right?
What? Well,
by watching the movie?
Yeah. I'm sure there was something.
By watching Days of Heaven.
Yeah. So anyway, Shepard's death affected me pretty heavily. I will say, and again, this would require a very long kind of an explanation. The last years of Shepard's life were rather difficult, not just the fatal disease that he got, which was, Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, which was incredibly painful and difficult. And I think that involved like the last 2 years of his life. His alcoholism became very serious. He was arrested twice for drunk driving, and the second time they took his license away, which he writes about in his last book, The One Inside. And then his relationship with Jessica Lange ended, which he also writes about in the book. So things, I don't know if you could say things were falling apart for him. Also, he had not written a really good play, I think. Well, it's hard to say. I haven't seen all of his recent plays, because he never stopped writing, and he was always doing plays. But most of them were kind of like flops. They were on off-Broadway, and they were not received very well by the critics or audiences and so on. But anyway, so his death affected me pretty drastically. And it's still affecting me. I mean, it's 5 months later, and it's hard to stop thinking about it. Shepard was just sort of although I didn't really see him very much after I left New York. He was a very big part of my life. Okay. So anyway, this is called Death of a Famous Man. And who would have guessed exactly this? After all the years of fame and glory, that it would come down to a horrible disease, to lie wasting on a bed, nothing to do but bear it. The strong, powerful man, or at least he once was. Maybe the alcohol had something to do with it. He had spent his entire life telling the story of how his father got drunk one day and stepped out into traffic, killing himself. Maybe it was suicide, maybe not. And maybe alcohol is passed down from one generation to the next, although when he was younger it was drugs, not drink, the favorite addiction. Oh yeah, things had begun to fall apart long before this. She just couldn't take the cheating and the lying. What kind of man would be unfaithful to a woman like her? But he was. The 2 arrests for drunk driving, and then blood began flowing out of his nose, and he couldn't stop it. He wrote about it. He wrote about everything. You knew things were not going well for him, but you didn't know why. He had always been a presence in my life. Ever since I met him at the age of 20, we hung out for a while, but then I never saw him. It seemed inconceivable he could die. He was so healthy, so happy, so muscular. Surely I would go first, but I didn't. So many friends, famous friends, cream of the crop. It was like he was riding down the highway in a pickup truck, and a cop stopped him, and the cop was death. Goodbye, old friend. I'll join you riding down the highway, but not now. You're up there writing a play about it.
When did you write these?
I wrote that, a couple weeks after he died. Well, the first one I wrote well over 5 years ago. Okay. And by the way, it is a prose poem. It's not. And then the poem about his death was maybe a couple of weeks after he died.
Any closing thoughts?
Any closing thoughts
about Days of Heaven or Shepard?
Days of Heaven. One thing I was going to mention, and this is going to sound a little weird. I've seen the film several times, and I never really liked Shepard's performance. It was his first movie. There are some stories about when he was shooting the movie that Malick was very unhappy about his performance, and so were a lot of other people on the set. But I must say, looking at it today, I think he gives a terrific performance, and I don't know why I have changed my mind. I haven't seen the movie in a long time. I think his performance is certainly as good as anybody else in the movie, which includes Richard Gere and Brooke Adams and Linda Mance. And, he really was not an actor when he shot this film. He had never really done very much acting at all in his life. And there's the story, which is part of the Criterion collection, about how he got cast in the movie, which I'm not going to go into because it's kind of a long story. But it was kind of a fluke that he ended up playing a major role in a Hollywood movie. And that was the beginning of a very major film career. So it was totally unexpected. I don't think anybody who knew him ever thought he would become a film star. But he sure jumped into it. And
what do you think is his best movie as an actor?
That's hard to say. Well, The Right Stuff, of course. He got nominated for an Oscar in The Right Stuff. And I haven't seen all of his films.
Mud was quite excellent.
Mud was fantastic.
Now, when you look back, did you want to make it as a theater director professionally?
Well, I got to a point where I said, this is not going to happen. And I got out, and I became a lawyer, which is not unusual. A lot of actors become lawyers.
How many years were you doing theater full time?
Roughly five. I mean, I was working day jobs and things like that, and then sort of the height of my professional career was I got hired at the ACT, and I worked with them as a stage manager for a while, which I'm writing about right now, this novel I just started.
And what is ACT?
American Conservatory Theater. It's the largest theater company in San Francisco, has been for many, many years. And
what years were you there?
I was there for 6 months, 67 and 68, and I got laid off. And then I went through, this is what I think is the basis of a pretty good novel, if I could just write it. I went through these huge transitions. My first job after I got laid off at ACT was at a bank. And it was very painful because what I really wanted to be was a director.
A theater director?
Yeah.
But let me ask you this. I know we're running out of time. But
Yes.
One of the things that really struck me, you just said, was he was still an alcoholic up until he died, right, almost?
It's hard to say.
But an addiction to alcohol.
Normally, you're not in a position to drink when you have Lou Gehrig's disease. I think he was drinking. In the one inside, he talks a little bit about his alcoholism.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and apparently, according to him, he swore off alcohol when he was in the process of breaking up with Jessica Lange. And there's a scene in the book where she comes to visit him in Kentucky. And, he owned this thoroughbred horse farm in Kentucky, which probably cost him a lot of money. And she comes to visit him, and he deliberately abstains from drinking while she's with him. And then they sleep together. So essentially they're separated, but she came to Kentucky to see him. And it's like all of his prose pieces are kind of elliptical, but they sleep together, and then she leaves. And according to him, as she's leaving, she says to him, "Oh, you're going to be in bed with that little porn star of yours as soon as I leave, aren't you?" And he denies it. He says, "I denied everything." Although most of the book is about the porn star. So, obviously, he doesn't call her a porn star, but it's this very younger woman.
Like in her 20s?
Yeah, easily. That he's having this very sexual relationship with. So apparently Jessica Lange knew what he was doing. And I remember when he was in San Francisco doing the late Henry Moss, and you saw the video about the late Henry Moss. The newspapers were full of gossip items that he had a girlfriend in San Francisco, and that he was...
well, that's the last movie we watched, was this so-called disaster, right?
Okay, now that was in 2000.
Right.
So he was still, coupled up with Jessica Lange at that point. But
how about to close off with one word to describe Shepard, and then I'll cut it.
I don't think that can be done.
One word?
Well, the word that would come to mind, but it's a word I don't like to use a lot, is genius. And he was a genius, without a doubt. But the genius would apply almost strictly to his playwriting, because I don't think it applies to his prose pieces. I don't think he was a very good actor. I would not call him a genius as an actor, but some of his plays, are just among the very best written in the 20th century by an American. So,
which of his plays do you think everybody should read?
Well, Buried Child, without a doubt, but there's a whole bunch of others, and he was incredibly prolific. I think they've counted 55 plays that he wrote, and he really started tailing off later in his life as he became an actor. And I don't know. Well, it's funny. The same thing happened to Wilson. His later plays are really not very good. And he wrote also, again, some of the greatest plays in the 20th century. But definitely Buried Child, Fool for Love, The Curse of the Starving Class. There's a kind of a short play that I think is one of the best things he ever wrote. Okay, I'm jumping around here. There's a play called Geography of a Horse Dreamer, which is incredibly brilliant. But this short play, it runs about an hour. It's a one-act play. You can perform it as a long play because it does run about a little over an hour. It's called Suicide in B flat, and that is just an amazing play. How he wrote that play, which is about jazz. And, generally when he's concerned with music, it's rock music. But in Suicide in B flat, he definitely wanted to focus on jazz. And it's just an amazing play. So I've named a bunch.
Well, I know we got the game to check out, so...
Well, if possible, yeah.
So I guess we'll cut it there.
Okay.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you,
today,
Jeff.
Bill.
I really enjoyed being interviewed. I'm glad you asked me to do this.
We finally... this has been in the works for about how many months?
A couple, at least.
At least maybe 3.
Well, it's hard to say. And I may write more poems about him. I honestly don't
I think you should
know.
write one about just Days of Heaven, the film. The film itself.
That could be done. That could be done. And by the way, we haven't really talked about Days of Heaven, but
No.
that is an incredible movie. That is just and why Malick was so disgusted with himself that he decided not to direct a film.
Well, it was the experience of making the film, right? Was what
Something went wrong. Well, after he finished shooting, it took him 3 years to edit the film. And, and I guess he did the right thing, because he eventually came back with a whole bunch of very great films, in the early 2000s. And it's incredible that, Hollywood was willing to hire him after he had essentially been out of the business. But it looks like he kept his contacts going, and apparently they were asking him constantly if he would do a film, and he always kept saying no. And then finally they talked him into The Thin Red Line, which was this huge success. And by the way, his style, which is always fairly the same, but you can really see a lot of the same stylistic things in The Thin Red Line that he did in Days of Heaven. But Days of Heaven is a very remarkable film. And in a way, I guess you could say it was kind of an accident, because they had no idea how Shepard was going to perform. But Malick was convinced that Shepard would make a very good film actor, even though he'd never really acted. And there's so much that's sort of dragged into the film, one slot at a time, and somehow when they were finished editing it, and it still wasn't a commercial success, but eventually people figured out that this is really one of the greatest films.
Do you think it was too artsy for people for it to be a commercial success?
I think that was part of it. It probably wasn't promoted very well. And it took a long time for people to really realize how good it was. It's taken me a long time. Every time I see it, and I told you that story about seeing it in a bar, and so there was a live audience, and they didn't know what Days of Heaven was about.
Or who Terrence Malick was.
Yeah. Well, this would have been, I think, sometime during the 90s, and so they knew it was a Sam Shepard film. They knew it had a good reputation. And as the film is going on, and I'm sitting there in this bar, and you're hearing people saying, wow, look at that, wow. And then it was over, and it was like, they had just seen one of the best films they were ever going to see. And, and at that point I said, yeah, okay. This film really has something. So it's so deep. There are so many layers of meaning and of artistry, and as a matter of fact, you can replay it, and you will see something new in that film, I think, every time you watch it. So, and it's still not clear exactly what it's about and what the meaning of the film really is. Is it sort of like some kind of a murder? Not exactly a murder mystery, but it basically revolves around a murder.
It's kind of noirish in a way. Sort of. Yeah.
Sort of.
Not overtly, but there's these nuances of noir.
Well, okay, Brooke Adams is not a femme fatale.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
As a matter of fact, she's extremely innocent, and
more in the way the photography is very noirish.
Sort of. Because noir, you're talking, there's this term which is used, chiaroscuro.
Yeah.
Okay, which this is not.
It's not, but there's just certain shots and there's certain images in the film where if the music was a little bit different, it would suddenly be this either horror movie or noir because of the way it's lit.
Yeah, well,
it's very moody, very.
That's very true.
Atmospheric, and
Yeah, it does have things. It is not a film noir.
No,
but
just these subtle kind of nuances.
It is extremely subtle.
Yes.
And Malick, well, I don't want to say Malick is always subtle, but when he decides to be subtle, I don't think there's anybody who does subtle better than Terrence Malick. So, and that's especially true in Days of Heaven. It's kind of a mystery, the whole film. It's like, how did it get made? What is it about? Why did he want to make this kind of film? And
where did you get the story from?
Everything.
Because it is an original screenplay.
It is, and I'm sure there's a story behind that, but I don't know what the I want the story. Okay, this is the last Days of Heaven story. Okay. The scene where Richard Gere is hunted down by the police and they shoot him. And there's a very, very brief shot, which is shot from the bottom of a pool of water that shows him flopping into... Okay. Apparently what happened on that shot, they didn't shoot it during principal photography. And Malick decided he had to reshoot certain scenes. So he needed to get a shot of Gere falling into a pool of water. They ended up at Sissy Spacek's house, and she has this huge aquarium. And Gere plopped down into this aquarium, and they shot it from underneath the aquarium, and that's how that shot. Oh, and then the thing about the locust. Well, we talked about that, but
that they were really peanut shells being thrown.
Yeah. Well, they also had a bunch of live locusts, which you can see in
for
the
the
film.
Close-ups.
Yeah, which they purchased. They bought the locusts from apparently the National Museum of Canada or something has live locusts. And they bought the locusts from this museum, so that's how they got the locusts. And the locusts play a big role, and he got them eating. They're chomping on these vegetables or whatever it is,
vines and leaves.
Yeah, and he really did the locusts extremely well.
Detailed.
Okay. But the thing about the peanut shells, okay, so they dropped them out of this helicopter, and they figured, okay, we can't show the peanut shells dropping to the ground, because then they won't look like locusts. Okay. So, as you know, they filmed it in reverse, and then the actors had to walk backwards. Okay, and then they ran it forward, and it's perfect. You're convinced they're locusts. You're convinced the actors are walking forward. And Shepard, in his last book, he writes about that scene. As a matter of fact, yeah. So.
Well, thanks,
okay.
Bill. Again, it's been fun.
Same here.
Hopefully I'll have some good imagery to put this to.
Well, I hope so. Okay.
Right. Until next time, Movie Land.
Until next time.